The bitter February wind howled through the mountain passes of northern Mexico as General Zachary Taylor gazed across the desolate landscape, knowing that his enemy was closing in like a wolf pack scenting blood. It was the 21st day of February, 1847, and the American forces found themselves positioned near the hacienda of Buena Vista, a small settlement that would soon become synonymous with one of the most pivotal battles in the Mexican-American War. Taylor's weathered face bore the marks of a lifetime soldier, his piercing eyes scanning the terrain that would either make or break his military career. Behind him, approximately 5,000 American troops, mostly volunteers from Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, and Arkansas, prepared their weapons and steeled their nerves for what promised to be a brutal confrontation. These were not the polished regulars of the Eastern establishment, but frontier fighters who had answered their nation's call to arms with the same spirit that had carved civilization from the wilderness. The general's intelligence network had brought disturbing news throughout the day. Mexican General Antonio López de Santa Anna, the Napoleon of the West as he styled himself, was marching north with a force estimated at over 20,000 men. This was the same Santa Anna who had orchestrated the massacre at the Alamo 11 years prior, whose very name struck fear into the hearts of Texans and Americans alike. His army was battle-hardened, well-equipped, and burning with the righteous fury of men fighting to defend their homeland against foreign invaders. As documented in historical accounts from the Library of Congress archives, the Mexican force had been moving steadily northward after their defeat at the Battle of Monterrey the previous September. Santa Anna had spent months rebuilding his army, gathering supplies, and planning his counteroffensive against the American occupation forces that had penetrated deep into Mexican territory. His strategy was simple, yet potentially devastating. Crush Taylor's isolated force before it could receive reinforcements, then sweep north to reclaim all lost territory. The terrain around Buena Vista favored neither side decisively, but its features would prove crucial in the coming battle. The main road from San Luis Potosi to Saltillo ran through a narrow defile between steep hills and ravines, creating a natural bottleneck that could amplify the effectiveness of a smaller force if properly defended. Taylor's engineers had spent weeks studying every ridge, every gully, every potential avenue of approach that Santa Anna might exploit. Colonel Jefferson Davis, commanding the 1st Mississippi Rifles, rode among his men, offering words of encouragement. These were the same volunteers who had distinguished themselves at Monterrey, proving that American citizen soldiers could match the professional armies of Europe in courage and effectiveness. Davis himself was a West Point graduate who had resigned from the regular army to serve his state, bringing military expertise to the volunteer forces that would prove invaluable in the trials ahead. The evening of February 21st brought ominous signs. Mexican cavalry scouts had been spotted on the distant ridges, their presence confirming that Santa Anna's main force was approaching rapidly. Taylor convened his senior officers in the adobe walls of the hacienda, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across their faces as they pored over crude maps and discussed defensive positions. Major John Washington, Taylor's chief of staff, spread out the reconnaissance reports that painted a grim picture. The Mexican army was not only vastly superior in numbers, but also better equipped with artillery and cavalry. Santa Anna commanded seasoned regiments that had fought in numerous campaigns, while many of Taylor's volunteers had never faced enemy fire. The mathematical reality was stark. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 4-1, yet Taylor remained characteristically calm, his confidence infectious among his subordinates. This was old Rough and Ready, the general who had never lost a battle, whose common touch and tactical brilliance had made him a hero to the common soldiers. He understood that battles were won not merely by numbers, but by positioning, timing, and the fighting spirit of the men who pulled the triggers. As the night deepened and the first stars appeared over the Mexican desert, both armies prepared for a confrontation that would echo through history. The stage was set for an epic clash between two military traditions, two nations, and two very different concepts of warfare in the New World. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Angostura Pass on February 22, 1847, as a solitary figure approached the American lines under a white flag of truce. The messenger, a Mexican officer resplendent in his dress uniform despite the early hour, carried with him a document that would become one of the most famous ultimatums in military history. General Zachary Taylor stood waiting, his simple blue uniform a stark contrast to the elaborate gold braiding of his counterpart. The Mexican officer dismounted with ceremonious precision, his spurs jangling in the morning stillness as he approached the American commander. With a formal bow, he presented Santa Anna's demand for immediate and unconditional surrender. Document, written in flowery Spanish diplomatic language, essentially declared that resistance was futile given the overwhelming superiority of the Mexican forces. Santa Anna, styling himself as His Most Serene Highness, offered Taylor and his men the opportunity to surrender with honor rather than face certain annihilation. The terms were generous by the standards of 19th century warfare. The Americans would be allowed to march out with their personal arms and would be escorted safely to the border. Taylor read the ultimatum in silence, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he considered the Mexican general's proposal. Around him, his staff officers waited tensely, knowing that their commander's decision would determine whether they would see another sunset. The mathematical reality was undeniable. Santa Anna's 20,000 troops represented an overwhelming advantage that conventional military wisdom suggested could not be overcome, according to historical accounts documented by the History Channel. Taylor's response has become legendary in American military folklore. Without hesitation, the general looked up at the Mexican emissary and delivered his famous reply, "Tell General Santa Anna to go to hell." The blunt rejection, delivered in Taylor's characteristic frontier style, sent a clear message that the Americans intended to fight regardless of the odds. The Mexican officer, visibly shocked by the crude dismissal of his commander's generous offer, remounted his horse and rode back toward the Mexican lines. Behind him, the American camp erupted in cheers as word of Taylor's defiant response spread among the troops. These frontier volunteers, many of whom had never seen a battle, drew courage from their commander's unshakable confidence in the face of overwhelming odds. As the morning progressed, both armies moved into their final positions for the coming battle. Santa Anna deployed his massive force along the ridges and valleys surrounding the American position, his colorful banners and gleaming weapons creating an impressive spectacle that was intended to intimidate as much as destroy. The Mexican general had arranged his troops in the traditional European formation, with infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, and artillery positioned to deliver devastating enfilade fire. Taylor's deployment was necessarily more defensive, utilizing the natural terrain features to maximize the effectiveness of his smaller force. The main American line stretched across the narrow pass, with the 2nd Kentucky Regiment anchored on the left flank against the steep ravines that protected that approach. The Indiana and Illinois Volunteers held the center, while the Arkansas and Mississippi regiments secured the right flank where the terrain was more open and vulnerable to cavalry attack. The artillery pieces, under the command of Captain Braxton Bragg, were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across the entire front. These guns, served by regular Army artillerymen who had trained for years in their deadly craft, would prove to be the decisive factor in the coming battle. Each cannon was loaded with canister shot, essentially giant shotgun shells filled with metal balls that could cut down advancing infantry like wheat before a scythe. Colonel Jefferson Davis positioned his Mississippi rifles in a strategic reserve behind the main line, ready to reinforce any point where the Mexican assault might break through. These men, armed with the latest percussion rifles and trained in marksmanship, that was legendary even on the frontier, represented Taylor's mobile strike force that could be thrown into action wherever the crisis was most severe. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, the tension became almost unbearable. Thousands of men on both sides checked their weapons, said their prayers, and thought of loved ones far away. The stage was set for a battle that would test every assumption about warfare in the New World, where citizen soldiers would face professional armies in a contest that would help determine the future of North America. The Mexican bugles began to sound in the distance, their haunting notes echoing off the canyon walls as Santa Anna prepared to launch his grand assault. Taylor stood calmly among his men, his presence alone worth 1,000 reinforcements to the volunteers who looked to him for leadership in the trials ahead. The earth trembled beneath the feet of 20,000 Mexican soldiers as they began their descent into the Angostura Pass at precisely 10 o'clock on the morning of February 22nd, 1847. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, a vast river of blue and white, uniforms flowing down the mountainsides like an unstoppable avalanche, their bayonets glinting in the desert sun as regimental bands played the martial airs that had once echoed across the battlefields of Europe. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna rode at the head of his massive column, his chest blazoned with decorations earned in decades of warfare across Mexico and Central America. The general's elaborate uniform, complete with gold epaulettes and a plumed hat, marked him as a commander who understood the psychological impact of pageantry in warfare. Behind him rode his staff officers, veterans of campaigns stretching from the halls of Montezuma to the pirate-infested coasts of Veracruz. The Mexican strategy was as bold as it was straightforward. Santa Anna intended to use his overwhelming numerical superiority to smash through the American lines at multiple points simultaneously. His plan called for diversionary attacks on both flanks while the main assault, led by his finest regiments, would punch through the center of Taylor's position and roll up the defenders like a carpet. Leading the central assault were the regiment of sappers, elite engineering troops who had distinguished themselves in the siege warfare that characterized much of Mexican military history. These were professional soldiers, many of whom had served for over a decade, their ranks filled with veterans who understood the deadly mathematics of infantry combat. Supporting them were regiments from Puebla, Oaxaca, and Guadalajara provincial, units that brought fierce regional pride to their service under the national banner. The Mexican cavalry, over 3,000 strong, positioned themselves on the flanks where the terrain offered opportunities for the kind of sweeping charges that had decided battles across Europe for centuries. These horsemen, mounted on the finest horses that the haciendas of central Mexico could provide, carried sabers that had been forged in the armories of Toledo and Birmingham. Their commanders, many of whom had studied military tactics in European academies, understood how to coordinate mounted charges with infantry advances to maximize the shock effect on enemy formations. Is documented in military analyses from the American History Central Archives. The Mexican artillery consisted of over 40 pieces, ranging from massive 24-pound siege guns to lightweight mountain howitzers that could be quickly repositioned during battle. These weapons, many of them captured from Spanish colonial arsenals or purchased from European manufacturers, represented a significant technological advantage over the smaller American force. The initial Mexican advance proceeded with textbook precision, each regiment maintaining its position in the grand formation as they approached the American lines. Santa Anna had deployed his forces in the traditional European style, with skirmishers advancing ahead of the main body to probe for weaknesses in the enemy position. These light troops, armed with British-made rifles and trained in the latest tactics, represented the evolution of Mexican military doctrine from the chaotic warfare of the independence period. The psychological impact of the Mexican advance was exactly what Santa Anna had intended. American soldiers, many of whom had never seen more than a few hundred men assembled at one time, stared in awe at the seemingly endless columns of enemy infantry. The sound alone was overwhelming: thousands of marching feet, the rattle of equipment, the shouted commands of officers, and the continuous rumble of artillery pieces being wheeled into position. Captain Braxton Bragg, commanding the American artillery, watched the Mexican deployment with the professional interest of a West Point-trained officer who understood the capabilities of the weapons arrayed against him. Bragg had spent years studying European military manuals, and he recognized the formation patterns that Santa Anna was employing. More importantly, he understood the weaknesses inherent in such traditional approaches when faced with the concentrated firepower that modern artillery could deliver. The first Mexican shells began falling among the American positions at 11:30. Great geysers of earth and stone erupting along the defensive line as Santa Anna's gunners found their range. The bombardment was intended to soften the American defenses before the infantry assault, a standard tactic that had proven effective in countless European battles. The psychological effect was immediate. Volunteer soldiers who had never experienced artillery fire dove for cover as the deadly projectiles screamed overhead. Yet the American line held firm, anchored by the steady presence of officers like Colonel Jefferson Davis and the fighting spirit of frontier volunteers who had not traveled 1,000 miles from home to surrender at the first sound of enemy guns. These men, farmers and mechanics in civilian life, proved that American democracy could produce soldiers equal to any in the world, when their cause was just and their leadership competent. The Mexican assault began in earnest at noon, with Santa Anna's finest regiments advancing in perfect formation across the valley floor. The sight was both beautiful and terrible: thousands of men moving in unison, their bayonets creating a steel forest that seemed to stretch from one end of the battlefield to the other. This was warfare as it had been practiced in Europe for generations, the product of military traditions that stretched back to the age of Napoleon. The thunderous roar of Mexican artillery reached a crescendo as General Zachary Taylor rode along his defensive line, his calm demeanor providing a steady anchor for his volunteer soldiers who were experiencing their baptism of fire. It was approaching noon on February 22, 1847, and the fate of American expansion into the Southwest hung in the balance as 20,000 Mexican troops prepared to unleash their full fury against the outnumbered defenders. Taylor's tactical genius became apparent as the Mexican assault developed. Rather than spreading his forces thin across the entire front, Old Rough and Ready had concentrated his strength at the most critical points where the terrain favored the defenders. The narrow pass that gave the battle its name forced Santa Anna to funnel his massive army through predictable avenues of approach, negating much of his numerical advantage and allowing the Americans to achieve local superiority at the points of contact. The 2nd Kentucky Regiment, positioned on the American left flank, bore the brunt of the first Mexican assault. These volunteers, many of whom were veterans of Indian fighting along the Ohio frontier, proved that American marksmanship could more than compensate for inferior numbers. Their long rifles, designed for hunting in the dense forests of Kentucky, proved devastatingly effective against Mexican infantry attempting to advance across the open ground of the valley floor. Colonel William McKee, commanding the Kentucky Regiment, had positioned his men in a defensive formation that maximized their firepower while providing protection from enemy artillery. The Kentuckians lay behind hastily constructed stone walls and earthworks, their rifles creating interlocking fields of fire that turned the approach to their position into a killing ground. When the Mexican assault began, the distinctive crack of Kentucky rifles created a continuous rolling thunder that echoed off the canyon walls. The Mexican infantry, advancing in the traditional European column formation, found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire that their training had not prepared them to handle. The tightly packed ranks that had proven so effective in Napoleonic warfare became a liability when faced with the accurate fire of American frontiersmen who could hit a squirrel's eye at 100 yards. Mexican officers, conspicuous in their elaborate uniforms, fell in alarming numbers as Kentucky sharpshooters picked them off with methodical precision. Captain Braxton Bragg's artillery section proved to be the decisive factor in breaking up the Mexican assault. Bragg, a West Point graduate who would later achieve infamy as a Confederate general, demonstrated the tactical brilliance that made him one of the finest artillerymen of his generation. His guns, loaded with canister shot, turned the narrow confines of the pass into a slaughter pen where advancing Mexican infantry found no escape from the deadly hail of metal. According to battle reports preserved in the Smithsonian Institution archives, Bragg's battery fired over 300 rounds during the course of the battle, an extraordinary rate of fire that was made possible by the intensive training his gunners had received. Each piece was served by a crew of seasoned regulars who could load, aim, and fire with mechanical precision, even under the most extreme conditions of combat. The Mexican cavalry, which Santa Anna had positioned to exploit any breakthrough in the American lines, found themselves unable to operate effectively in the broken terrain of the pass. The steep ravines and rocky outcroppings that characterized the battlefield negated the mobility advantage that mounted troops normally enjoyed, forcing the Mexican horsemen to operate as dismounted infantry in an environment where they possessed no particular advantage over their American counterparts. Colonel Jefferson Davis and his Mississippi Rifles occupied a position in the American center, where they could reinforce any threatened point along the defensive line. Davis, a West Point graduate who had resigned from the regular army to serve his state, brought professional military expertise to his volunteer regiment that proved invaluable in the crisis. His men, armed with percussion rifles that represented the latest in military technology, possessed a rate of fire and accuracy that gave them a significant advantage over their Mexican opponents. The battle reached its climax when a Mexican column managed to penetrate the American right flank, threatening to roll up the entire defensive position. This was the moment that Taylor had been preparing for, and his response demonstrated why he had never lost a battle in over 40 years of military service. Rather than panic, Old Rough and Ready personally led a counterattack that restored the American line and sent the Mexican assault reeling back in confusion. Taylor's leadership style, which emphasized personal example over elaborate tactical maneuvers, proved perfectly suited to commanding volunteer troops who responded better to courage than to complex military theory. The sight of their 63-year-old commander calmly riding among them under heavy fire inspired the American volunteers to feats of heroism that seemed impossible given their lack of formal military training. The first day of battle ended with the Mexican assault broken against the American defensive line. Santa Anna's casualties were mounting at an alarming rate, while the Americans had suffered relatively light losses despite being heavily outnumbered. The tactical advantages of defensive warfare, combined with superior American marksmanship and artillery, had negated much of the Mexican numerical superiority. As darkness fell over the battlefield, both armies prepared for the resumption of combat on the following day. The Americans had proven that they could stand against professional Mexican troops, but Santa Anna still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and was determined to achieve the decisive victory that would drive the invaders from Mexican soil. The pre-dawn darkness of February 23, 1847, hung over the battlefield like a funeral shroud as both armies stirred to life for what promised to be the decisive day of the Battle of Buena Vista. General Zachary Taylor had spent the night moving among his troops, his weathered face a mask of calm determination as he prepared his volunteers for the supreme test that awaited them with the rising sun. Santa Anna had used the hours of darkness to reorganize his battered forces and prepare for one final, overwhelming assault that would either crush the American resistance or exhaust his own army's capacity for further offensive action. The Mexican general understood that time was working against him. His supply lines were stretched thin. His troops were beginning to show signs of exhaustion, and reports from his intelligence network indicated that American reinforcements might be approaching from the north. The Mexican plan for the second day was brutally simple in its conception. Rather than attempt another frontal assault against the prepared American positions, Santa Anna would launch coordinated attacks against both flanks simultaneously, forcing Taylor to divide his already limited forces and creating opportunities for breakthrough that could be exploited by the Mexican reserves. The key to success lay in timing. If the flank attacks could be launched simultaneously, the Americans would be unable to shift their forces to meet both threats. Colonel Jefferson Davis and his Mississippi Rifles had been repositioned during the night to anchor the American left flank, where intelligence reports suggested Santa Anna was concentrating his strongest forces for the morning attack. Davis, whose tactical acumen would later make him president of the Confederacy, understood that his position was the key to the entire American defensive scheme. If his regiment broke under the Mexican assault, the entire American line would collapse like a house of cards. The Mississippi volunteers who served under Davis represented the finest fighting material that the American frontier could produce. These were men who had grown up with rifles in their hands, who could shoot a running deer at 200 yards, and who possessed the kind of individual initiative that made them formidable opponents in any kind of warfare. Their weapons, the latest percussion rifles available from American manufacturers, gave them a significant advantage in both range and accuracy over their Mexican opponents. Captain Braxton Bragg had repositioned his artillery during the night, creating concentrated fields of fire that would channel any Mexican assault into predetermined killing zones. Bragg's tactical brilliance lay in his understanding that artillery was most effective when used in mass, concentrating firepower at the critical point rather than spreading it thin across the entire front. His guns were loaded with double charges of canister, turning each piece into a giant shotgun capable of cutting down entire companies of advancing infantry. The dawn attack began at precisely 6 o'clock, announced by the thunderous roar of Mexican artillery that had been moved into position under cover of darkness. Santa Anna's gunners had learned from the previous day's experience, concentrating their fire on specific sections of the American line, rather than attempting to suppress the entire defensive position. The bombardment was the most intensive that any of the American volunteers had experienced, with shells falling so rapidly that the individual explosions merged into a continuous rumble of destruction. Through the smoke and dust of the artillery barrage, the Mexican infantry began their advance. This time, Santa Anna had abandoned the rigid European formations that had proven so costly on the previous day, instead deploying his troops in loose skirmish lines that presented more difficult targets for American marksmen. The attacking columns moved with the fluid grace of veterans who had learned to adapt their tactics to the realities of warfare in the New World. As documented in military reports from the National Archives, the Mexican assault on the American left flank achieved initial success that threatened to crack the entire defensive position. A regiment of Mexican grenadiers, elite troops selected for their size and courage, managed to penetrate the American line at a point where a rocky ravine provided cover from the devastating artillery fire that had broken previous attacks. The crisis of the battle arrived when Mexican cavalry, exploiting the breakthrough achieved by their infantry, poured through the gap in the American line and threatened to roll up the entire defensive position from the rear. This was the moment that every military theorist feared, the point where a defensive battle could collapse into a rout that would destroy an entire army in a matter of minutes. It was at this critical juncture that Colonel Davis made the tactical decision that would save the American army and secure his place in military history. Rather than falling back in the face of the Mexican breakthrough, Davis ordered his Mississippi Rifles to form a V-shaped formation that created interlocking fields of fire against the advancing Mexican cavalry. This formation, which would later be known as the Davis Formation, concentrated the firepower of his regiment at the precise point where it could do the most damage to the enemy attack. The result was devastating. The Mexican cavalry, caught in the deadly crossfire created by Davis's tactical innovation, suffered catastrophic casualties that broke the momentum of their charge and sent the survivors fleeing back toward their own lines. The sight of their elite cavalry in full retreat demoralized the Mexican infantry, who began to waver just as their assault was reaching its climax. General Taylor, recognizing that the moment for counterattack had arrived, personally led a charge that drove the remaining Mexican forces back across the valley floor. Old Rough and Ready, mounted on his favorite horse Whitey and armed with nothing more than a sword and his own indomitable courage, became the symbol of American determination that inspired his volunteers to extraordinary feats of heroism. Afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the blood-soaked valley as the Battle of Buena Vista reached its climactic moment on February 23, 1847. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, his elaborate uniform now stained with dust and sweat, faced the bitter reality that his massive army was being systematically destroyed by a force less than one-fourth its size. The mathematical impossibility of the situation would have been laughable if not for the thousands of Mexican casualties that bore witness to the deadly effectiveness of American defensive tactics. Santa Anna's final gambit was as desperate as it was brilliant. Recognizing that conventional tactics had failed against the American position, the Mexican commander decided to stake everything on one last assault that would either achieve decisive victory or exhaust his army's capacity for further offensive action. He ordered every available unit infantry, cavalry, and artillery to concentrate against a single point in the American line, creating a spearhead that would punch through the defenses and split the American force in half. The target of this supreme effort was the position held by the Arkansas and Illinois volunteers, many of whom were experiencing combat for the first time in their lives. These citizen soldiers, farmers, and merchants in peacetime suddenly found themselves facing the concentrated fury of the most professional army in Latin America. The psychological pressure was enormous. They could see the vast Mexican formations massing for the attack, could hear the enemy bands playing martial music, could feel the earth trembling beneath the feet of thousands of advancing soldiers. Colonel Archibald Yell, commanding the Arkansas Regiment, understood that his men represented the weakest link in the American defensive chain. His volunteers, while possessed of individual courage and marksmanship skills, lacked the discipline and cohesion that came from years of military training. If they broke under the Mexican assault, the entire American position would collapse and Taylor's army would be destroyed in detail. The Mexican assault began with a preparatory bombardment that surpassed anything previously experienced in the battle. Over 40 pieces of artillery concentrated their fire on a front less than 300 yards wide, creating a storm of metal that seemed to make the very air itself deadly. The American volunteers, crouched behind their improvised earthworks, could only endure the terrifying bombardment and wait for the inevitable infantry assault that would follow. Through the smoke and dust came the flower of the Mexican Army, the Regiment of Guards, elite troops whose uniforms bore the battle honors of dozens of campaigns stretching back to the wars of independence. These were professional soldiers in the truest sense, men who had dedicated their lives to the military profession and who understood the techniques of shock combat that had dominated European battlefields for generations. The initial impact of the Mexican assault was devastating. The Arkansas volunteers, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers pressing against their position, began to fall back in disorder. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that Santa Anna's gamble had succeeded, and that the American line was about to collapse. Mexican cavalry, sensing victory, spurred their horses forward to exploit the breakthrough that would destroy Taylor's army. It was at this moment of supreme crisis that the character of American democracy was put to its ultimate test. Rather than flee in panic, The retreating volunteers rallied around their officers and began to fight as individuals, using their superior marksmanship to exact a terrible price from the advancing Mexicans. Every tree, every rock, every fold in the ground became a fortress from which American rifles spoke with deadly accuracy. Captain Braxton Bragg, whose artillery had been repositioned to support the threatened sector, unleashed a barrage of canister fire that turned the narrow valley into a charnel house. According to battlefield reports documented by the Smithsonian Institution, Bragg's guns fired over 100 rounds in 30 minutes, a rate of fire that represented the absolute maximum that black powder artillery could achieve under combat. Conditions. The turning point came when General Taylor himself arrived at the threatened position, his presence alone worth a regiment of reinforcements to the wavering volunteers. Old, rough and ready, his uniform torn by enemy bullets and his face blackened with powder smoke, epitomized the kind of leadership that American democracy could produce, a man who led by example rather than by rank, who shared the dangers of his soldiers rather than directing them from safety. Taylor's tactical decision to commit his final reserves to the threatened sector represented a calculated gamble that would either save his army or destroy it completely. The 2nd Kentucky Regiment, held in reserve throughout the battle, was ordered to advance into the teeth of the Mexican assault and restore the American line. These volunteers, many of whom had never seen a battle before arriving in Mexico, were about to face the supreme test of their courage and discipline. The counterattack that followed became the stuff of military legend. The Kentucky Volunteers, advancing with the steady precision of regular troops, crashed into the flank of the Mexican assault just as it was reaching its climax. The psychological impact was immediate. Mexican soldiers who had been on the verge of victory suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction, their formations disrupted and their momentum broken. Colonel Jefferson Davis, recognizing the critical importance of the moment, led his Mississippi Rifles in a supporting attack that completed the destruction of the Mexican assault. The famous Davis formation once again proved its deadly effectiveness, creating interlocking fields of fire that cut down the Mexican reserves before they could exploit their initial breakthrough. As the sun began to set over the battlefield, Santa Anna was forced to confront the bitter reality of defeat. His army, which had begun the day with overwhelming numerical superiority, was now a spent force incapable of further offensive action. The flower of Mexican military might lay scattered across the valley floor, testament to the deadly effectiveness of American defensive tactics and the fighting spirit of volunteer soldiers defending their flag. The crimson sunset of February 23, 1847, painted the battlefield of Buena Vista in shades that seemed fitting for one of the most decisive engagements in American military history. As the last echoes of gunfire faded across the valley, General Zachary Taylor stood among his exhausted volunteers, knowing that they had achieved something that would reshape the destiny of North America. The impossible had become reality. A small force of American citizen soldiers had defeated the largest and most professional army that Mexico could field. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, his dreams of military glory shattered like glass against the rocks of American determination, began the bitter process of acknowledging defeat. The Mexican commander, who had begun the battle with over 20,000 troops, now surveyed the remnants of an army that had been systematically destroyed by opponents who should have been crushed by sheer weight of numbers. The casualties told the story with mathematical precision. Over 3,000 Mexican soldiers lay dead or wounded on the field, while American losses numbered fewer than 800. The withdrawal of the Mexican army began under cover of darkness, a dispirited procession that bore little resemblance to the magnificent force that had descended into the valley 2 days earlier. Santa Anna's soldiers, many of whom had marched over 1,000 miles from central Mexico to reach the battlefield, now faced the prospect of an even longer retreat through hostile territory with inadequate supplies and shattered morale. The Napoleon of the West had met his Waterloo in the deserts of northern Mexico, as documented in battle reports, preserved in the National Archives. The Mexican retreat became a rout as discipline collapsed and entire regiments dissolved into armed mobs. The professional soldiers who had begun the battle with such confidence now abandoned their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape the valley of death that Buena Vista had become. Mexican artillery pieces, many of them captured from Spanish colonial arsenals or purchased at great expense from European manufacturers, were left behind as testimony to the completeness of the defeat. The psychological impact of the Battle of Buena Vista extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. Mexican public opinion, which had supported the war effort with patriotic enthusiasm, began to question whether continued resistance to American expansion was possible given the demonstrated superiority of American military tactics. The myth of Mexican military invincibility, carefully cultivated by Santa Anna's propaganda machine, lay in ruins along with his army. For the United States, the victory at Buena Vista represented the coming of age of American military power on the world stage. The citizen soldiers who had stood firm against professional Mexican troops proved that democratic institutions could produce fighting men equal to any in the world. The frontier values of individual initiative, marksmanship, and stubborn determination had triumphed over the rigid military hierarchies that characterized European armies. General Taylor's reputation, already high among the American public, was elevated to the level of national hero by his victory at Buena Vista. Old Rough and Ready became the embodiment of American military virtues, brave, competent, and utterly dedicated to the welfare of his soldiers. His calm leadership under fire, his tactical brilliance in positioning his forces, and his personal courage in the face of overwhelming odds made him the natural choice for president when the Whig Party sought a candidate who could capitalize on military success. The tactical innovations developed during the battle, particularly Colonel Jefferson Davis's V-shaped formation and Captain Braxton Bragg's concentrated artillery tactics, would influence American military doctrine for generations. The lessons learned in the crucible of combat at Buena Vista would be applied by many of the same officers during the Civil War, where the stakes would be even higher and the consequences even more far-reaching. The strategic consequences of the battle extended throughout the Mexican-American War and beyond. Santa Anna's defeat at Buena Vista eliminated the last major Mexican field army capable of challenging American control of northern Mexico. The road to Mexico City now lay open to General Winfield Scott's expedition. While Taylor's forces were free to consolidate American control over the vast territories that would eventually become the southwestern United States. The human cost of victory was not forgotten in the celebration that followed. American field hospitals were filled with wounded volunteers who had paid a high price for their country's expansion. The Kentucky, Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana, and Mississippi regiments that had borne the brunt of the fighting suffered casualties that would be mourned in small towns and farming communities across the American frontier. Mexican casualties were far heavier, reflecting the brutal mathematics of attacking prepared positions with inadequate tactical coordination. Entire Mexican regiments ceased to exist as effective fighting units, their survivors scattered across the desert or captured by American patrols. The flower of Mexican military leadership lay buried in the rocky soil of Coahuila, victims of American marksmanship and artillery fire. The Battle of Buena Vista officially ended the active phase of the Mexican-American War in northern Mexico, though formal peace would not come until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed over a year later. The territories that American blood had purchased in the valley of Buena Vista would become the states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, an empire larger than all of Western Europe. As the American flag flew over the battlefield where so many had died, The survivors understood that they had participated in one of the pivotal moments in their nation's history. The victory at Buena Vista had not only secured American control over the Southwest, but had also demonstrated to the world that the United States possessed the military capability to defend its territorial ambitions against any opponent. The young republic had announced its arrival as a major power through the thunder of its guns and the courage of its citizen soldiers in the mountains of Mexico.